Wait, let me get yours. Which number is on your plate? We want to see you go over. This one, I'll put that one as well. Number 3. There were 2 on the back. If we did not see all. 4. Okay. What? I'll do 1. Someone who's like 1. Alright, so we'll do 1, 3, and 4. For number 1, if we were solving for m, we have to get rid of a by doing what? Dividing. So we would divide both sides by a. They would cancel here. So m equals n plus b. P plus b all over a. Questions on that one? That is. Right. For number 3, give an equation that is perpendicular to y equals negative 2x plus 1. So we have to first remember a slope that would be perpendicular. This is over 1. We're going to take this, flip it, make it positive. So if our slope is 1/2, give me some y-intercept for this equation. 4. It could be whatever you want. The slope just had to be the same, and it had to be in this format: y equals 1/2 x, whatever you wanted your y-intercept. Questions on that one? And then 3, 4. So we are solving this. You could do this one of 2 ways: either cross multiply, because this is over 1, or just get rid of 63 by multiplying. You end up doing the same thing, really. You multiply those 2 numbers, what do you get? Someone multiply those 2 numbers and tell me what you get. One more time. 2,000. So if you got a huge number that was negative, this looks like 2 different numbers. I'll fix that a little bit. Right. Any other questions on the shark bite before we move on? As I mentioned last week, today is the last lesson of Unit 4, Systems of Inequalities. So we're going to do that lesson. You'll have time to practice. When we get to the practice part, you can work through practice, work on those math, work on missing tests, retake work, all those things. To me, next class is your quiz, and Friday is your test. Also, this is the last unit that is going in this marking period. Everything else that we do towards the end of break will go in the next marking, which means if you have not retaken Unit 2B, finished Unit 3 / retaken Unit 3, you need to do that soon. Okay. All right, let's read through some of this stuff. So for your systems of inequalities, it is very much like your graphing linear inequalities. The rules are the same. Change the equation, return some slope-intercept form. Some of these are more for graphing regular lines, not inequalities, so that's okay. Plot the y-intercept, graph your slope, determine if this is a dashed or a solid line. Yours are a little grayed out because it's highlighter. If you want to write these in, do that. And then larger would be greater than or greater than or equal to. Smaller would be less than or less than or equal to. And we're gonna see, for these, you want two different pencils, or like a pencil and a pen, two different colors, color pencils, something that shows you two different colors. Or if you're just using a pencil, make sure you shade in two different directions. So if you would like color pencils, there are some in the colorful part. If you would like highlighters, they're back there. You need a ruler, you can grab one from the colorful part. We're gonna skip numbers 1, 2, and 3 because the graphs are really small, and do the one at the bottom. Okay, for the one at the bottom, one of them is already in slope-intercept form. The other one we have to solve. Which one you do first is up to you. So let's say we graph the one that's already in slope-intercept form. So start at your y-intercept -5. Your slope is -2, so we can go down to right 1, up to left 1, as many times as possible. Because this isn't equals, would this be dashed or solid? Oh, solid. And then, so you can go ahead and make your solid line, connect all your points, draw arrows at the end. That's blue. And then if this is a greater than or equal to, is that going to shade above or below? Above. Greater than, above. So again, if you're not sure which side that is, look at your y-intercept, draw an up and down arrow. Up would be above, so shade this one. Remember, how you shade is up to you. There's a reason I'm doing this way, just for this one. Questions so far? That should be familiar from what we did last class. The other one we have to solve. How would we get this back in slope-intercept form? What is our first step? Opposite, because it's already negative. So add 3x. Add 3x to both sides. Start to put it in the right order. What's our last step to get y by itself? Divide everything by 5. Guys, I need you to focus, please. Okay, so now we can graph this one. Start at +2. Your slope is a +3/5, so we can go up 3 to the right 5. And down 3, left 5. Would this line be dashed or solid? Dashed. So to the best of your ability, draw dashes in between the points that you've made with arrows and this is less than, would it be shaded below or above? below. So from your y-intercept, below would be everything underneath. So if you're using the same, like you're just using a pencil for both, you may want to do something like this and maybe highlight where they both intersect. So then your solutions have to fall in where they both intersect, not just one. So let's test some of these and see if they do or do not. -2, -2. Does that one fall in the shaded area? 1, -1. Yes. 1, 1. Yes. 2, 5. No. 6, 0. Yeah. And that falls. If it falls on the line, just like last time, you would need to check it. When we did systems of equations, we checked for solutions. You would do the same thing. So like if it fell right here, it might work, it might not work. You have to check and see, does it work for both? We can do that when we come back. Right now. Alright, let's refocus. So I said I was gonna show you this, but then I realized that this could be like a decimal and I wouldn't really know what it is. So we're gonna figure a different one. So let's say I chose this point, the y-intercept of this line. So +2, 0, 2. If I were to check this, put this into both inequalities, we would see if it's a solution or not. So all the background noise of talking, I need to stop. Thank you. Right, so I'm gonna put that in this one first. Y is greater than or equal to -2, sorry, not y, 2 minus 5. So if I were to put this point in, I'd have 2 is greater than or equal to 0 minus 5, or 2 is greater than or equal to -5. Is this a true statement? Is 2 greater than -5? Yes. So that one works, but then we also have to test it in this one. So 2 is less than 3/5 times 0 plus 2. So if I were to put that in, then I get 2 is less than 2. Or 2 is less than 0 plus 2, and then 2 is less than 2. Is this a true statement? If it's equal to, then yes. But because that is not, one of them doesn't apply, it can't be a solution. Questions about that? Go on to the next page. Some of your shading didn't really print, so if you need the overlapping, it is me. If you would like to shade that in so you can see it, do that. Refocus. Okay, we're gonna do one of these. If we want to see another, then we'll do that one. So this is very much like what we did last class, where we were stating the system and then stating a solution. It doesn't really matter the order. I'm gonna highlight these so we can talk about the different ones. I'll just leave this one. Okay, so let's talk about the green one first. We have to find the slope and y-intercept. It's a solid line, so that should be easy. What is the y-intercept of this line? Where does it cross the y-axis? This one. 4. Okay, then we need to find the slope. So look at where does this cross the grid lines exactly. It looks like every time I go down one, right one, there's another point, slope point. You don't have to follow those points. But then our slope would be a -1. So we know this much about this line so far. Y plane -1 x plus 4. This was a solid line, so it has to be greater than or equal to or less than or equal to. Is this shaded above or below this line? Below. So that's going to be less than. Questions on that one? Same thing for the other ones. Right, we have to find the y-intercept of this one. I think Abir said this one was -2. Then we have to find the points that will cross the grid lines exactly. It's dotted. So we might be able to find one exactly. Like I see it goes to the point 2. If I counted up to over 2, that's really just 1. So it should go through every up 1 over 1. This one we do have to make sure it does do that for everything. Because you may think it's 1, but it's really like 3/4 or 2/3 or some close fraction, and then it's a little off. Be careful with that one. But this one is 1. So what we know about this one so far, y length 1x minus 2. This is a dashed line, so it has to be greater than or less than. Is this shaded area above or below that line? Above this one. So this would be shaded above, and the other one is shaded below. So above would be greater than. Right? Then we just need to state a solution. So give me one ordered pair that would fall in this. -4, 2. Anyone else want to think of one? We're also with -3, 1. Are there any other problems on this page we want to see to go over? See or do or go over. I am going to show you what the shading on 3 and 4 look like, so you can at least try that on your own time. So there are 2 different sets of shading. You can either do both sets or just the overlapping. I will highlight that a little bit better. So that is just the overlapping. So if we're doing number 4, same as before, we have a solid line, we have a dashed line. Let's look at the solid line first. What is the y-intercept of this line? I'll outline it so you can see a little bit better. 1. And then we need to find a point that crosses the grid lines exactly. Someone tell me that order pair. Where do you see another point on that line? Not 3, but 5. So my slope here, I'm going up 1, 2, 3, 4 to the right 1. We know this is a solid line, so it can be greater than or equal to or less than or equal to. I'll start it off, y blank 4x plus 1. In this overlapping area, is it shaded above this line or below it? Up here or down here? So for the red line, this would be shaded underneath it, not above it. But that would be below. The y is less than or equal to 4x plus 1. And then let's do the blue one. What is the y-intercept of this dashed line? Not quite, it's close. -1 would be further up, -3. Right, then we need to find another point that crosses that grid line exactly. Yours is a little hard to see, so you can look at the board if it's easier to see. I want to say this point. So that would be up 2/1. Let's see if that tracks. That looks right. And then if the line kept going, it would be the other one. So 2/1 or 2. Dash line, it has to be strictly greater than or strictly less than. I said that backwards. So we know so far y blank 2x minus 3. For that overlapping shaded area, is that shaded above or below the dashed line? Above. So would that be greater than or less than? Greater than. Y is greater than 2x minus 3. Someone give me a solution that would fall in there. That works. Anyone else want to give a solution that might work? 6 would also work. It's like just inside the line, but that works. I'm going to show you this in the calculator again, just because it works a little differently when it's a system. So if you don't have a calculator, go grab one. Yes. You're back with this. So we're gonna go to the same place. Some of yours might already be in this, but it depends. So go into X. Go into n equals. I fixed a bunch of the calculators last time, but if you still don't have n equals, this one. Raise your hand so I can grab that calculator. So go into app and go into inequals. Yours doesn't have that. That's my grab. Grab a different one. You. I like you. The great North doesn't have it. No, it does. It just doesn't have the other ones. But when you finish with that, let me see it start to have the other ones. And we'll be okay. So go into equals, hit enter. If you get a screen that looks like this, you were already in it, so just hit continue. If you don't see a screen that looks like this, you just got in it. If you hit continue, it should take you to this screen. If you didn't hit continue, go into y equals. I'm going to use the two examples that are on your paper. So one is y is less than 3x plus 2. So I'm going to change, if you have something in there already, you can change it. If you don't, then you're going to hit, go over to the equals, where it's highlighted, and then alpha, whatever button you need. So alpha window, to change it to less than, and then 3x plus 2. And then you're going to use greater than or equal to for the second one. So that is graph, alpha graph. And then we can't use alpha y equals like putting it into a fraction here because we are already in equals. We would use parentheses. -1 divided by 2, x minus 4. Make sure the -1/2 is inside the parentheses. Anyone need help with putting those two in? Then you can graph it. Yours is just going to show black lines in one direction and then the other. Mine will show different colors. And then there are different ways to look at it. I think if I go into shades, alpha y equals, you'll see these three options. So the original shade, that's both of them. One of these you don't really want, the other one is okay. So I'll show you what all of them do. If I choose the first one, graphs the first one, and then it graphs where just the overlapping is. So that one's really nice to see, is my overlapping in the right place? Alpha y equals, if I do the second one, this is just everything combined. That doesn't really help you. So I would probably stay away from this one. So 1 or 3 are good options. 2, not so much. Questions on the how we use the calculator for that? No. Well. Look on the next page. Find any questions you want to see. You go over the next page and the back of that. Were there any that we wanted to see you go over, have questions about on this page? What about the back of this page? All right on. We're gonna do these two and then you'll have time to practice. These words that are missing is overlapping region. This is very similar to the first problem we did where we have to solve one of them and then graph the other. It doesn't matter which one you do first. Again, I would recommend using 2 different colors or shading in 2 different directions. I'm going to graph this one first since it's already in slope-intercept form. Start at positive 4. What's your slope there? For this one? Negative. We're going to go down 1, right 1, as many times as possible. Fill up your graph, it'll be a lot of points. And up 1, left 1, as many times as possible. Again, a lot of points. Would this line be dashed or solid? Solid. So connect all of your points with a solid straight line. Draw arrows at the ends. This is greater than or equal to, would that be shaded above or below? Above. So above would be everything up from the y-intercept, so everything here. Evelyn, please make sure you're graphing this. And then for the other one, we have to get it back in slope-intercept form. How would we do that? We could do that, but we still have to move the x somehow. Add x to the other side. 3y is less than x plus 21. And then everything by 3. So y is less than 1/3 x. X over 3 is the same as 1/3. Graph that. Start at positive 7. Your slope is a positive 1/3, so go up 1 to the right 3 as many times as possible. Down 1, left 3 as many times as possible. Would this line be dashed or solid? little dashes in between. With this line, it is less than be shaded above or below, but yes, below. So below the y-intercept would be everything here, so everything up here. You don't have to highlight it, but if it helps you see it, slash would help me see it more, highlight it. The main thing is make sure that I can see where you're overlapping is. If I can't tell, it just looks like one big thing of shaded. Questions on 2? Flip to number 8 on the back. Right, so we have to solve the first one. Divide everything by 8. Focus for the last problem. To divide everything by 8, you could use your calculator or do it by hand. Graph that one. Your slope is negative. So you should be going up and left or down and right. Dash or solid. Dash. I'm not going to write the word, but know that it's dash. Shaded above or below? Above, because it's greater than. Again, I'm not going to write those words, but keep that in mind. Right. The other one is already simplified, but it is just a number. It is a y, so we have to remember our wave-ups. Y inequalities are graphed horizontally. So on your y-axis, when y is 2, put a point. Would this be dashed or solid? Would you say solid? So draw a solid line straight across. Would this be shaded above or below? Below, because it's less than. So everything done. That would be the overlapping region. Questions on this? All right. As your quiz and tests are coming up, I should not see any phones out while we're practicing. You can keep working in this. You can work on the 2 self-maths that are due on Friday, the regular graphing inequalities and the systems. I have the review if you would like that to start practicing on. If you need to finish your press and want to do that now, you can do that. If you want to retake, you can come see me to get that work. Be working on one of those things. Yes.